Welcome to our weekly Church on the Rock podcast. For more information, visit us at churchak.org, download our Church on the Rock AK app, or like us on our Facebook page. Thank you for listening, and we hope you enjoy our weekly podcast.
We're launching into a brand new series today called Full Send, and really we're looking at the topic of worship, and even more specifically, worship as an expression in music. So worship is much broader than that, of course, but we're going to be digging into that, dialing into that. So we can go ahead and go to my first slide here, how did those get in there? Just leave them up there for a moment so the Spirit can move. Man, it was a good hunting trip. I just want to say that out loud, and now we're going to move on because we got a bunch of other stuff to cover. If you'll allow me, even if you won't allow me, I'm going to do it anyways. But I want to get on a little bit of a soapbox for a moment here. I actually don't even know what that means. I just know it means there's a burr in my saddle, and there's some things I want to share with you, and I believe they actually do tie in to our topic, but it's a little bit of a sidebar. And I want to talk about this idea of deconstruction or deconstructionism and actually deconstructing it. Because turnabout's fair play, right? Here's the thing I've noticed. We currently live in a world that loves questioning everything. But questioning is different than deconstruction. And I want to look into it for a moment, but I want to start with this passage found in 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 5. The church in this community of Corinth is, messed up. They got some issues. You think we got issues? They got issues. And they've believed all kinds of things, and Paul is trying to address how they sort out truth, what you can know and what you can't know. And so here's what he says. It says, we demolish, I love that word, we demolish arguments and every pretension, right? Ego-driven, pretentious, every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God. In other words, what you can know, because knowledge is attainable, against the knowledge of God. And we take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ. This is like Christian Brazilian jiu-jitsu. Like, we're going to wrestle it to the mat, and we're going to take this thought, and we're going to ask some questions about it. We're going to pull it apart, and then we're going to find out, does it withstand the test of Christ? Does it withstand, ultimately, the test of knowledge about who God is? Because you can know some things. And we're currently living in a generation that is obsessed with questioning everything and yet terrified of concluding anything. Obsessed with questioning everything. Every authority, every preconceived idea, every interpretation. Obsessed with questioning everything but terrified of concluding anything, which, by the way, is by definition what deconstruction is. Maybe you've heard this word, maybe you haven't. It's certainly a popular buzzword these days, and it's really rooted in this idea of whatever you grew up hearing when you were younger probably isn't true, and you need to go re-explore all of it. But what it really is you need to cast all of it out, and you aren't allowed to come back to the same conclusions again. In fact, in the 1960s, this philosophy emerged. It's actually taken a lot of abuse in the philosophical community because it's actually a philosophy without an intent. In fact, it by definition is designed to do this as a theory of literary criticism that questions traditional assumptions about certainty, identity, and truth. It goes on to say this: deconstructionism is not concerned with the discovery of truth or distilling correct conclusions, but rather with the process of questioning itself. It is a process characterized by uncertainty and unknowability. For this reason, its founder explains, deconstruction is not a method, rather it is an ongoing process of interrogation. It is not a search for a truth or an objective origin. It is not done with a particular aim other than the continual tearing down of hierarchical systems by refusing to yield to dogmas. Did you catch that? The actual aim, the intended aim of deconstructionism is actually to endlessly ask questions without ever coming to conclusions, because when you come to conclusions, then you have a corner on the market in truth, and a hierarchical system is established. Those who have truth and those who don't have truth. And it's actually designed as a system by which you never conclude anything. In Acts chapter 17, just so you know, because there's actually nothing new under the sun. What has happened before is repeated again. We currently find ourselves in a moment that's described in Acts chapter 17. Paul the apostle, who knows the scriptures really well, and he's making his way around sharing the gospel, and now he's in particular sharing the gospel with a non-Jewish community, a Greek community. And not just the Greeks, but the philosophers of the day. The ones who are taking all of the ideas and wrestling with them and creating new philosophies, and yet they're not actually concluding anything. In fact, in Acts chapter 17, this is how the text begins, verse 21. It should be explained that all the Athenian philosophers, as well as the foreigners in Athens, seemed to spend all their time discussing the latest ideas. Just talking about whatever new thing has come up. So Paul, standing before the council, addressed them as follows: Men of Athens, I notice that you are very religious in every way. It's an interesting statement. For people who don't conclude that there is any one truth, they're actually very religious in their openness to every truth. It's all true. You actually find that there's a very religious spirit, a desire to allow everything to be worshipped. Everything is permissible under this umbrella. I've noticed that you're very religious in all your ways. For as I was walking along, I saw your many shrines, and one of your altars had this inscription on it: to an unknown God. Since we may have missed one along the way, let's just put one to the unknown God, because you can't know everything, and you can't know all of the gods and goddesses. And so in case we've missed one, let's add one in here, and this is to the unknown God. Now listen to how tender he is in the way that he actually approaches them. This God, whom you worship without knowing, is the one I'm telling you about. He is the God who made the world and everything in it, since he is Lord of heaven and earth. He doesn't live in man-made temples, and human hands can't serve his needs, for he has no needs. He himself gives life and breath to everything, and he satisfies every need. Listen, I want you to understand, this God doesn't need anything from you. I just want to introduce you to him because you need everything from him. He's not like the other gods and goddesses who need you to bring sacrifices, who need your obedience. This God actually needs nothing. His invitation to you is strictly out of a desire for your good. In fact, he's impacted in no way, shape, or form whether you choose to worship him or not to worship him. It's actually for you, not for him. He's very different than all of the other deities you've identified. I would say this, as Christians in particular, there is a responsibility to think deeply and critically about the things that we believe. We actually have a responsibility to ask questions in order to discover truth, because it is discoverable. And you've heard me say this before, I'll say it again, but you should never be afraid of asking questions. God is not afraid of your questions. You should not be afraid of asking questions if you want answers. But the current approach is to ask questions just for the sake of tearing down ideas. It actually isn't in a pursuit of answers. But you should never be afraid to ask questions if what you want and desire are answers. But you should be very concerned about trusting someone who tells you that there are no answers. You actually were not created to live in that kind of uncertainty. That's good, Pastor. I know. I've really enjoyed that segment right there. Several years ago, there was a worship leader named Michael Gungor. He had a band called Gungor. And I really enjoyed their music early on. I enjoyed the creativity. I enjoyed the approach. And maybe you've heard the song before, but You Make Beautiful Things. That was one of their songs, I know. And then they sort of kind of headed off the rails. I have some good friends who were in personal relationship with them. They had some life experiences that were really challenging. They felt like the church responded really poorly to them. And they sort of headed off on this tangent, this journey of rediscovery. It was really a journey of deconstructing their old ideas, but never actually reconstructing anything specific as a result. And recently I heard that they were putting out worship music again. And I thought, well, I loved their worship music before. I'm really curious to hear where they landed, because it actually doesn't bother me at all when someone's sort of on a journey, as long as that journey brings them to a destination. And then I'm really curious about what the destination they've arrived at is. And so I went on the Facebook page and the Twitter account, and I just began to read and see what they were describing, because they're going to make worship music again. Now, here is Michael Gungor's description of the process. If God is everywhere and in everyone and everything, then what could possibly hide God? Still, it can certainly feel like God is hidden, can't it? But isn't that only because we expect God to be a certain way? If I don't let go of my expectations, of my rigid beliefs, I won't be free to experience God as God actually is. I will instead just be left with the constructs of my own mind, of what God ought to be. Which has some ring of truth to it, and yet there's a starting assumption that if you don't address it, leads you to all kinds of following conclusions. He says this: if God is everywhere and in everyone and everything, is that true? I mean, at least from a biblical perspective, is that what the scriptures describe, that God is in everyone? Well, Romans chapter 8, verse 9 and verse 14 describe it in this way. You are controlled by the Spirit if. You hate that word. Those if statements in the scriptures. Like, I would rather them just be like, you're controlled by the Spirit. I don't care what you believe or who you believe in or who you worship. You're controlled by the Spirit. We're all controlled by the Spirit. Isn't that great? But you're controlled by the Spirit if you have the Spirit of God living in you. And remember that those who do not have the Spirit of Christ living in them do not belong to him at all. Verse 14, for all who are led by the Spirit of God are children of God. This is a term we throw around somewhat flippantly, but semantics matter. The words that we use to describe things actually matter. And I hear people frequently say, we're all children of God, but that's not a biblical understanding. I mean, if that's the standard of truth and where I discover truth, it's not a biblical understanding. In fact, if you don't have the Spirit of God, then you aren't a child of God. Would it be true to say we're all created by God, designed by God, desired by God, loved by God? That would be absolutely true. But to say that you're a child of God just because you're a human is not a biblical concept. Oh, snap. And now listen, I'm not saying you're an awful person. I'm just saying words matter and how we describe things matter. In fact, I have an obligation to love you whether you're a child of God or not, with the same kind of love, to forgive with the same kind of forgiveness, right? We're not talking about who we love and who we don't love, but we are talking about who is a child of God and who isn't. And so to say that God is in everyone and in everything is really an Eastern idea, mysticism that says God is in all things. In other words, God is all the material things you see around you. And what we end up doing is worshiping the material instead of the eternal. But let's carry on. From the early 2000s, he carries on, the worship leader version of Michael Gungor, to the I'm not sure God is real of early Gungor, to the I don't want to sing about Jesus anymore universalism of the last few years. It was quite a journey. Through all of it, here's what I've discovered. I really love God. In fact, what you'll discover is explicitly absent in all of the music now and all of the writing is Jesus. Can you love God without loving Jesus? From a biblical description, no. But it's safe to love God. But when you start to talk about Jesus, oh, now you've narrowed it down. Now you've narrowed it down to this egocentric God, insecure God, this Jesus who needs you to worship him. But remember, Jesus doesn't need anything from you. He's kind of like your oncologist, right? He's like, you have cancer. Here's the prescription I'm going to write for you. Here's the treatment process for you. If you will follow this process, you can be cancer-free in a matter of time. And you say, oh, no, I'm not going to do that just because you need me to do whatever you want me to do. He doesn't need anything from you. He's just telling you the truth, which is exactly what Jesus is doing. He's not saying, oh, would you please worship me? I feel so much better about myself if you'd worship me. Would you submit to me? If you would just obey me, I would feel so good. So many days I'm so depressed. You know how many people won't obey me? But if you would obey me, man, I'd feel better. That is not the Jesus in the scriptures. He is simply telling the truth. And it actually doesn't affect who he is one way or the other, whether you choose to believe it or not. He's just being honest with you. In fact, in 1 John chapter 4, verses 2 through 3, this is how we know if they have the Spirit of God. If a person claiming to be a prophet or a worship leader, for that matter, because it is just speaking the word of the Lord in music, acknowledges that Jesus Christ came in a real body, that person has the Spirit of God. But if someone claims to be a prophet and does not acknowledge the truth about Jesus, that person is not from God. He goes on, and when I think about what I want to spend my creative energy on, it's worshiping and enjoying the full spectrum of my love of God. When I say worship, I'm not talking about the shamey, listen to this, homage paying to some other being, but the experience of love and connection that can happen when people get together and sing to their source. Worship is saying yes to your life, to your source. So I'm not worshiping some other being, paying homage to some other. What I'm really doing in worship is paying homage to me. Because we are created to worship, and we will all worship someone. But being honest about who or what that is actually really important to our spiritual life. In fact, he goes on to say, here's a meditative song about Kundalini or the Holy Spirit or whatever you'd like it to be about. I just want you to know, Kundalini, this Hindu goddess, and the Holy Spirit are not the same thing. In fact, the word literally means coiled serpent. Here's a representation of Kundalini. It's residing in the base of your spine, and when you do Kundalini yoga, it's actually intended to conjure this spirit that brings harmony in your life. I'm just telling you, say what you want, but they aren't the same thing. But it certainly seems humble. It certainly seems like we're all in. You're just calling it a different name than I call it, but it's fundamentally a different deity. And that matters when it comes to worship. Here's why it frustrates me. Romans chapter 1, verse 19, this is how it's described. They know the truth about God because he has made it obvious to them. For ever since the world was created, people have seen the earth, sky, though through everything God made, they can clearly see his invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, so they have no excuse for not knowing God. Yes, they knew God, but they wouldn't worship him as God or even give him thanks. And they began to think up foolish ideas of what God was like. As a result, their minds became dark and confused. Claiming to be wise, they instead became utter fools. Verse 25, they traded the truth about God for a lie. So they worshiped and served the things God created instead of the Creator himself, who is worthy of eternal praise. It's worth deconstructing deconstructionism. It's rampant in our society, this philosophy of asking questions but expecting no conclusions. And you actually should expect to be able to come to conclusions. And speaking of praise of God, described in Romans, can I worship however I want, whenever I want? Well, if God is who he says he is, then doesn't he have permission to be worshiped in a way that he desires, by a name that he desires? And the answer to that is yes. I mean, sure, there are lots of forms of worship. You could worship in your car. You could worship in the woods. You can certainly worship while you're out hunting. It's one of the best ways to worship. But there are actually prescribed ways, more specifically ways that you and I are not to worship, that are dishonoring to God and dishonoring to one another, which brings me to worship wars. How many of you grew up in the church? Wow, I'm so happy for all of you. How many of you are so glad you grew up in a perfect church? Let's go ahead. But if you grew up here, I want to see your hand. You already discovered this, right? There are no perfect churches. And what you've been told is because there are abuses in authority, then all authority is bad, or because there are abuses in churches, there are things that churches get wrong, and you should not trust any institution or any church. And that creates a real series of problems because you become your own institution, your own authority, right? But the reality is that churches have problems. And one of the major things that I've experienced in churches over the years is what's known as worship wars. I grew up in church. We had worship services, we had worship teams, we had worship albums that were being produced, we had nights of worship, but worship was almost always built around the idea of music, and every decade or so we would have worship wars. Now, if you don't know what a worship war is, you're going to understand it as soon as I start talking about it, and I'm so glad they don't exist anymore. But worship wars, about every decade or so, a worship war would break out. It's too loud. It's too repetitive. There's too much electric guitar. It's too much like a performance. This music is too old. Those hymnals are too outdated. It was always about something, right? Like, those are worship wars. In fact, I'll never forget, because my dad's from a different generation than me, sitting with my dad in service one time, and we're singing the song, I could sing of your love forever. I could sing of your love forever. I could sing of your love. And on and on and on. And eventually, and if you know my dad, he's really quiet, really mild mannered. My dad just sort of leans over to me and he says, I think we're going to. This is how my life ends, singing this same line over and over and over again. He was not at all impacted and engaged in worship in that moment. And yet in the room, there were people who were like, I can sing of your love forever. Like, let me just do it right now. And right, worship wars are kind of built around all of these differences of opinion when it came to music and style and all of those kinds of things. And so we made a shift a few years ago, and we began to describe worship differently. We began to describe worship as all of life, which is true. Technically, there's only one verse in the Bible that describes all of life as an act of worship, because actually everywhere else in the scripture, starting in Genesis all the way through Revelation, more than 290 times, worship is referenced in connection with music or singing. In fact, I'll just say this because I want you to know the worship wars are over, because this verse settles it, but loud music and singing, that's what the Bible's, okay. Trying to poke the bear. But connected with music and singing, and that's actually because music is a powerful thing. When we talk about worship, I think a definition of worship is actually really important. Here's the definition of worship: the act of expressing reverence and adoration for a supreme being. Notice I didn't say God or Jesus, but a being that you view as supreme, which means that we all worship something, more specifically, someone. If you were to examine your thoughts about worship and your description of God, you may discover that God is actually you, your personal preferences, your own ideas, your own desires, your own ambitions, or you may discover that it's the God of the Bible, or you may discover that it's some other deity that you've given power to in your life. But worship is actually an action. It's the act of expressing reverence and adoration for a supreme being, and music is a primary and key way that we do that. And there's no denying the power of music in our lives, right? I mean, how many of you have that song that every time it comes on, you are like transported back to the locker room in high school, or your first date, or that dance, or whatever, right? Like, I don't know why. For all the things I've forgotten, including my children's names on a regular basis, like I've got all of these songs stuck in this ADHD brain. Every now and then I'll go on these medleys at home, like everything from down in Louisiana next to New Orleans, away back in the hills among the evergreens, stood a log cabin made of earth and wood, lived a little boy named Johnny Be Good. He never learned to read and write so well, but he could play a guitar just like a ring and a bell. Go, 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 Johnny, go, go, right? You got it. Or here we go, do-si-do, come on, baby, let's go, boot scooting. Cadillac, blackjack, baby, meet me out back, we're gonna boogie. Get down, turn around, go to town, boot scooting. Yeah. Or Eazy-E. I have no idea why that's still stuck in there. This is a stick-up. Everybody get face down. Ring-gag the mouse so they can't make a sound. Tie them up for the fact we got to do this fast. I got my hand on my gat and I'm tempted to blast. I had to change some lyrics there for you, but I don't know. I don't know why I just know that music has power, like it strikes something in us. My parents listened to all of these oldies like Alley-Oop and oh man, don't get me started. An Elvis medley? You want an Elvis? No, I'm not going to do it. Okay. But music actually matters, I think, often more than we're willing to admit. Because sometimes music actually elicits an emotional response in us. I'll give you an example. There's a song, I actually love the song, if I could say that, by Imagine Dragons. Right? All my life I've been living in the fast lane, can't slow down, I'm a rolling freight train. You know it? Anybody? 3, okay, 4, good. I used to listen to the song for running, and I discovered it's terrible for running because the tempo is just too fast for distance running, and so I'm worn out too soon. But if you try and half time it, it's way too slow, and so it's like this tension all the time. So I actually eliminated it from my running playlist, and now I only do super slow songs so that I can walk run. But it actually, there's something, I noticed it here not too long ago because the song would come on, in my phone's playing in my car, and I'd be driving around, I'd be like, all my life I've been living in the fast lane, can't slow down, I'm a rolling freight train, one more time, gotta start all over, can't slow down, I'm a lone red rover. And I realized there was something going on internally in me, and here's what it was: anxiety. Like the song, like the tune and all of that is like a fun song to sing, but it was actually causing a feeling, an emotion inside of me, and the emotion was this: that's me. I can never stop. Just got to keep moving, got to keep going. One more time, got to start all over. Here we are. I can't slow down. I don't have permission to. I can never stop. Like my life is moving too fast, the pace is too fast, I'm just trying to keep up with it, and I don't have permission to stop. And I thought, that's not true, but it's how I'm feeling. And I had to pause and say, how do I evaluate what's healthy for me when it comes to music and what is not? Because it's a question worth asking. And I actually want to give you 3 tools that I use to evaluate music in my life. And I'll say this. This is not a prescription. These are principles. In fact, you have to discern for yourself if it's true in any given situation. In fact, I've had conversations with close friends who could clearly identify to me that when they spend the bulk of their time listening to worship music, something about their attitude, their perspective in life, depression disappearing, those kinds of things are abundantly clear to them. Like they can see the benefits, feel the benefits of engaging in this kind of music versus this kind of music, and yet, just like going to the gym, they find themselves gravitating towards things that produce unhealth in their life. Anybody else find that same war in your own life? Let me give you these 3 principles, not prescriptions. The first one is this: explicit nature. I don't mean, does it say explicit lyrics on the cover of the album? I mean, what is the explicit message being communicated in the song? Because that actually matters. There are some songs that I used to listen to, and I loved the harmonies. I mean, some of the stuff from the Civil Wars, like, not Civil War era, that was my dad's music, but like, sorry, Dad, but the band, and I would listen to it, and then I realized at some point the explicit message in the song is a message of physical abuse in a relationship and not being able to break away from you. Or the explicit message is an adulterous message, thinking about someone other than my spouse. And I had to pause for a moment and say, wait. Now, don't get me wrong, there are songs we've probably all listened to, right? Like Big O Jet Airliner, which we all thought was Bingo Jet Had a Light On. Bingo Jet had a light on, don't carry me too far away. Like, it wasn't until much later I even discovered the lyrics. Like, there are some songs you just listen to, you're not even listening to the lyrics, right? But it is worth evaluating what is the explicit message being communicated in a song and acknowledging that that has an impact on me. The second one is emotional experience. What does this make me feel? Am I even aware of that? There's nothing wrong with an emotion tapping into a song or a song pulling an emotion out of us. There is something wrong with a song keeping us in unhealthy emotional states. And sometimes we gravitate towards those things that express something going on in us, which isn't inherently wrong, but if we get stuck in that place, that actually produces destruction in our lives over time. The third one is this: an expression of worship. Who or what is being glorified through the music that I'm listening to? Listen, there are some songs that I listen to, like we were just in New Zealand, gone for 2 weeks. I'm on my way back, and I'm listening to some songs, and I'm like, I can't wait to see Kitchery. Like, just to get home, to be with her, to love her. Like, sorry. She's been gone over this weekend, too. It's been a long weekend. But right, that takes my mind there. But that, my love for my wife, my love for my children, could be an expression of my love and adoration for God as well. Who or what is being glorified in the music I'm listening to? Because music is actually intended to cause an emotional response. Now, I know some of you are thinking, and I've heard this numbers of times before, it's usually from men because women aren't afraid of their emotions. There's only one emotion that men aren't afraid of, and it's anger. Women. Because that's a power emotion. But I've heard men express to me, like, I don't know what's going on. Like, I haven't believed in Jesus yet, but I show up and you guys are singing these worship songs, and I'm watching people and they're crying and they have their hands lifted, and I'm just thinking, get yourself under control, right? Because we sort of have this backlash against emotionalism, but you were actually created with emotions. And God wants to capture your emotions and your intellect, right? He wants to capture all of you. There's nothing inherently wrong with music eliciting an emotion, right? As long as it doesn't trump everything else in our life. Passion matters when it comes to worship. And it's okay that it pulls an emotion to the surface. It's actually intended to do that, which brings me to the power of passion. There's a story in 2 Kings chapter 13. It's the story of Elisha. Elisha is a prophet of God. He's about to die. He's been the voice of God to the king of Israel for many years. He's about to die. In fact, the text tells us that he is on his deathbed. It says it's his final illness. And the king knows this. The king can tell that the time is coming. And the king's actually feeling an emotional response to the potential of the death of Elisha. And so he comes on the scene and he's like, my father, what are we going to do? The house of Israel will fall if the word of the Lord isn't here. The king clearly has emotions. He's weeping over the prophet. And so the prophet has one more word from the Lord for the king. And this is what he says to the king. He says, I want you to grab your bow. It looked just like this. This is an authentic bow from Israel that I grabbed last time I was at Walmart. Oh man, there's people on the back walls and stuff this time. Not good. There's a baby on that side last time. So I want you to grab your bow, and I want you to open the window to the east, which is this direction. I apologize. I only killed a handful of things with a bow, and they were much closer than this. So I want you to point out the east. I want you to draw it back, and I want you to shoot it out the window. The king's like, got it. Did it. I hit the wall. And the prophet says this to him. He shot an arrow. Elisha proclaimed, this is the Lord's arrow, an arrow of victory over Aram. You will completely conquer the Arameans at Aphek. Then he said, now pick up the other arrows and strike them against the ground. Okay? Shoot an arrow out the window. Did it. Grab the rest of the arrows, and I want you to strike the ground with them. And so king grabs the rest of the arrows, just like these authentic Israeli arrows. And he strikes the ground 3 times, which seems sufficient. It's more than one. It's more than 2. He strikes the ground 3 times, and then we're told this in the text. But the man of God was angry with him. But he did exactly what he told him to do. He struck the ground. He didn't tell him how many times. And the man of God was angry with him. And here's what he says. You should have struck the ground 5 or 6 times, he exclaimed. Then you would have beaten Aram until it was entirely destroyed. Now you will be victorious only 3 times. This passage has really puzzled me because it seems like the prophet could have just said, strike the ground 5 or 6 times and victory will be ensured. He doesn't tell him how many times. He just tells him to strike the ground. Shoot 1 arrow at the window, check, did it. Now strike the ground with the rest of the arrows, did it. But he's actually identifying something that is lacking in the king in this moment. You know what it is? Fervor, passion, zeal for God. He already knows God is speaking in this moment, and now he's like, do you want to hear the rest of the message? Here's what I want from you. I want you to take the rest of the arrows and I want you to strike the ground. And he's like, all right, God's going to speak. God's going to speak. 3. It's an apathy on the part of the king. It's a lack of passion or desire or zeal. He probably could have struck the ground once if there had been passion. And what the prophet is identifying is that you really want to hear from God? Show me some passion. Show me a little bit of zeal. Show me some desire that you could hear from God, because passion has power. It invites presence. And listen, it may look different for you than it does for me, but it should be present in us. And when he says, I want you to strike the ground, God's speaking. Do you want to hear from God? Do you want to understand victory? Do you want to experience it? And he should have gone like, yes, yes, I do. Ah, 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 ah. Listen to me. Just like in relationships, passion invites presence. Guys, you need to understand this. If your wife ever says to you, hey, do you want to go out on a date tonight? And you're like, guess. Just stay home. And when we're coming before the sovereign God of all the universe, listen, here's what I've discovered over the years. For those of you who know my dad's quiet. His passion looks different than mine because he doesn't have ADHD, maybe. I don't know. But his passion looks different than mine, but here's what I've discovered. It's observable. It's observable in his love of the word and his steadfastness and his passion for God. And here's what I'm telling you. I can't tell you what passion looks like for you. I'm just telling you it needs to be present. And you need to allow the Holy Spirit to evaluate your own heart because passion invites presence in worship. And we get passionate about all kinds of things. We can identify it. Other people can see it when it's on us. It can be like, oh, you're excited about this. You're passionate about this. And it should be true when we come into worship. It should be true when we lift our voices to the sovereign God of all the universe. It may look different for each one of us, but you must allow God to evaluate whether genuine desire, drive to invite his presence is present in you and in me. Would you stand to your feet? I've asked the team to go back into this song that we did a few moments ago. I also have carpet burns on my knuckles. There's that. But I've asked the team to go back into this song because the story that this song is sort of telling in the bridge is actually found in Luke chapter 7. I talked about this a few weeks ago. There's a woman who shows up at a party that she wasn't invited to. In fact, all the men are there, and they're doing their thing. It's all the religious leaders and the elite of the community, and she walks into the room without a ticket and without an invitation. But she actually doesn't care because she's not there for any of them. She's there because she's had an encounter with Jesus, and she can't help but show up in this moment and pour out her affection on Jesus. Like, it cost her something. She shows up in the room with this expensive perfume, but she actually doesn't care what anyone else in the room thinks about the way she's going to worship in this moment. And she just kneels at the feet of Jesus, just weeping in gratitude and wiping his feet with her hair and pouring out this ointment. And all the religious leaders are like, look at that freakazoid. Like, she's way too emotional right now. That's not what this gathering's all about. Like, we didn't get here to be all like, and yet here's what Jesus says. Then he turned to the woman and he said to Simon, look at this woman kneeling here. When I entered your home, you didn't offer me water to wash the dust from my feet, but she's washed my feet with her tears and wiped them with her hair. You didn't greet me with a kiss, but from the first time I came in, she has not stopped kissing my feet. You neglected the courtesy of olive oil to anoint my head, but she has anointed my feet with rare perfume. I tell you, her sins, and they are many, have been forgiven. So she has shown me much love. But a person who has been forgiven little only tends to show little love. How will passion show up in your praise? Because passion invites presence. And I can't think of a God who is more worthy of it than the sovereign God of all the universe. And so, Jesus, we just say thank you. Thank you for the privilege of lifting our voices. Would you meet with us in this moment right now? In Jesus' name, amen.
Thank you for listening. For more of our podcasts and to discover how you can connect, visit us at churchak.org or download our Church on the Rock AK app from either iTunes or Google Play.